Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. My job is to make sure that none of you miss the bus. So I will be keeping to the time because otherwise you'll be very angry with me. Okay, so Don Rutherford from California, San Diego is going to be presenting on Justice and Circumstances, Theodicy as Universal Religion.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm going to sit down here. So one of the wonderful things I think about this conference that Sam and Michael have organized is that it provides us with an opportunity to reflect on Leibniz's theodicy from a variety of points of view, and we've already, I think, seen that today. One can consider the book itself, the Essai de Theodicy, the circumstances of its publication, its argumentative strategies, and Leibniz's concern for its reception within both Protestant and Catholic circles. And we saw that, I think, in Greg's and Sean's and Bob's papers just a little while ago. But one can also think about the theodicy as an intellectual project in its own right, one which may be only partially or imperfectly represented within the essay, and one with which Leibniz arguably was preoccupied going back to the earliest parts of his career. And with respect to this project itself, one can think of it in a variety of different ways. Following a text that Moens quoted from 1669 this morning, one can understand it as Leibniz's attempt to offer a true apology for the Christian religion. But one can also, I think, approach the theodicy from the standpoint of reason, the domain of metaphysics or natural theology, as perhaps Nick Jolly pursued it this morning, where it might be understood as a defense of a theistic worldview, but not a distinctively Christian one. And going beyond that, I think it is important to distinguish an approach to the theodicy that characterizes it primarily in intellectual or theoretical terms, as a collection of doctrines and arguments, the approach, I think, that Paul Rateau pursued this morning. And on the other hand, one that links the theodicy to the broadest practical aims of Leibniz's philosophy, a dimension stressed in Maria Rosa Antignaza's biography, that in effect of bringing about the world of greatest human perfection and happiness. So the book itself is a contribution to his practical project. And here again, within the consideration of it as a practical project, one can represent this practical end from the distinctive perspective of Christianity or from the broader universal perspective of natural religion. And I think all of these perspectives are worth exploring, and it's great that we have them all represented here at this conference. But my particular interest is with the practical and universal aspects of Leibniz's theodicy. That's basically the way that I read it. In my view, the principal or primary importance of the book is as the expression of a distinctive theological outlook and of a particular conception of universal religion which Leibniz cultivated throughout his career. In the opening section of my paper, I discuss the foundation of Leibniz's theodicy, emphasizing the important ethical dimension he gives to it. In brief, it is Leibniz's view that the attainment of the highest human happiness or blessedness presupposes knowledge of the justice God exercises in the creation and government of the world, and the emulation of that justice in our dealings with other rational beings. In earlier writings, I have linked the substance of Leibniz's theodicy and of the ethics he predicates on it to analogous ancient views, in particular those of the Stoics. Here I approach the topic from the perspective of Leibniz's interpretation of Christianity, and in particular his recognition of the central role that divine grace plays in defining a theological outlook that breaks with Stoicism. One of Leibniz's main tasks in the essay is to demonstrate that the correct interpretation of the doctrine of grace is consistent with his overarching conception of divine justice. In the second section of my paper, I show how Leibniz argues for this conclusion by highlighting the significance of circumstances in determining whether or not a human being ultimately achieves blessedness or salvation. One of the main points I aim to bring out here is that although Leibniz is centrally concerned in the Theodicy with presenting a rational defense of revealed religion, in particular that the tenets of Christianity are in no way contrary to reason, the requirement of grace can be motivated from within the perspective of natural religion alone. In brief, Leibniz believes that the attainment of the highest human happiness presupposes, in addition to the excellence of an agent's natural powers, a kind of good fortune manifested in the particular place the agent occupies within the order of nature. In the paper's final section, I make the case that while Leibniz's theodicy is distinct from Stoicism in emphasizing the vulnerability of human beings to fortune or chance, identified with the particular grace God exercises with respect to each of them, in its outlook it is fundamentally universalistic and only secondarily Christian. Although Leibniz believes that his conception of divine justice is fully consistent with Orthodox Christianity and that his conclusions offer the best way of overcoming the schisms that have divided that religion, Leibniz's own religious sensibility extends the hope for salvation to all rational beings, pagan as well as Christian. What I can say about this will be brief, but I believe it is the deepest and most permanent lesson of his Theodicy, even if it remains only a subtext of the essays itself. The core tenet of Leibniz's Theodicy, as we all know, is that the actual world has been conceived and created by a supremely just God who chooses it as the best from among an infinity of possible worlds. This choice is explained by the combination of God's supreme goodness and wisdom. God's goodness inclines him to all ends in proportion to their goodness, and his wisdom is his infallible knowledge of the goodness of all things. Together, these attributes entail that God acts for the best. If he chooses to create at all, he chooses to create that possible world which has the greatest claim to existence. That is the world which contains in itself the greatest goodness, reality, or perfection. To this core tenet, Leibniz adds a second claim, a crucial claim, about the special place of rational beings within creation. All created beings contribute to the perfection of the world through their intrinsic goodness or perfection, and through the harmonious relations in which they stand to one another. Individually, rational beings contribute far more perfection than any other kind of being. They're just more perfect, and Leibniz sometimes says infinitely more, using that term loosely, I think. But they also contribute perfection in a fundamentally different way, insofar as they mirror in understanding God's own understanding of the perfection and order of all things. In short, while other beings contribute to the goodness of the universe merely by being parts of it, rational beings contribute by being parts that are capable of understanding how all the parts, including themselves, are ordered in the universe. More than this, based on their understanding of order, rational beings are able to replicate that order through additions they make to the perfection of the universe. Thus, they understand, they plan, they construct, with all of this order-creating activity being conceived by God as part of what makes this the best of all possible worlds. Finally, and most importantly, rational beings have the capacity to understand the special place they occupy in creation and how their role replicates the role that God plays with respect to creation as a whole. That is, they are able to grasp reflectively that they are beings who understand order and have the capacity to produce order in the universe, just as God has brought into existence the world in which the greatest diversity of things is ordered in the simplest and most elegant manner. Having understood this, rational beings are close to understanding a central feature of divine justice. As Leibniz construes it, justice is a disposition to do that from among a variety of alternatives for which there is the greatest objective reason. Rational beings are able to understand that this standard of justice guides the actions of the most perfect intelligence, God, and they can infer from this that the same standard of justice should apply to their own actions as well. Justice is a norm governing the conduct of all finite rational beings. To act rightly is to act for the sake of the best or the greatest objective good. Consistent with this, rational beings treat cases differently only if there is an objective ground in goodness for this difference. The capacity of rational beings to conceive of their moral personality, on analogy with the moral personality of God, underwrites what Leibniz calls the city of God. From this perspective, we are to think of ourselves as subjects who live under the rule of God as a perfect monarch. As Leibniz writes in the Monadology, the collection of all minds must make up the city of God, that is the most perfect possible state under the most perfect of monarchs. This city of God, this truly universal monarchy, is a moral world within the natural world and the highest and most divine of God's works. The glory of God truly consists in this city, for he would have none of if his greatness and goodness were not known and admired by minds. It is also in relation to this divine city that God has goodness, properly speaking, whereas his wisdom and power are evident everywhere. Leibniz's conception of the city of God includes two ideas that are essential for understanding the moral dimension of his Theodicy. First, as he indicates in this passage, it is only in relation to minds, he says, that God manifests his goodness, properly speaking. This statement must be understood with some qualification. The goodness of God's will is evidenced in God's disposition to produce good in whatever form it takes, metaphysical good, physical good, or moral good. However, the status of rational minds as subjects of the city of God, a status secured for them by their unique capacity to will as God does for the sake of the best, means that God has a special concern for the well-being of minds. Whereas God produces other beings for the sake of realizing a certain fixed degree of perfection within the order of the universe, God creates minds so they might do as well as possible, both morally and physically. God creates minds with the intention that they increase in perfection and that they prosper from their progress, which they do both instrumentally and immediately, insofar as, quote, all pleasure is a feeling of some perfection, Theodicy 278. And happiness, Leibniz says, is just, quote, a lasting state of pleasure, end state. Thus, God's will to create rational beings includes an intention that those beings attain the greatest possible perfection and enjoy the greatest possible happiness. Given this, we can say that God's goodness is manifested in the universal love or charity he shows toward rational beings, and this presumably is why Leibniz says that God has goodness, properly speaking, only in relation to his divine city. The goodness of God's intention toward rational beings is one dimension of Leibniz's conception of divine justice as the charity of the wise. A second dimension concerns God's knowledge of the intrinsic merit of the individuals he creates and conserves. God's will that rational beings do as well as possible, that they continue to progress in perfection and pleasure, is not absolute or unqualified. It is conditioned both by the goal of creating the world of greatest total perfection, which entails trade-offs among competing goods, and by considerations of desert. As subjects of the city of God who live under the rule of divine justice, rational beings can expect to enjoy happiness in proportion to how well they emulate in their actions the goodness of the divine will. As Leibniz comments in the Monadology, under this perfect government there will be no good action which is unrewarded, no bad action that goes unpunished, and everything must result in the well-being of the good. Thus, the culmination of Leibniz's conception of divine justice is that there is a perfect balance between virtue and happiness. Rational beings do well in proportion to the virtue they exhibit or the contribution they make to the overall perfection of the world. And God's justice is expressed in his will to preserve this balance. No virtuous action is left unrewarded, and no wicked action left unpunished. Leibniz is explicit in emphasizing the ethical implications of his Theodicy. No one can be fully happy without understanding her existence in relation to God's justice, he believes. This point is highlighted in the opening sentence of the Causa Dei. Leibniz writes, "The apologetic examination of God's case concerns not only divine glory, but also our advantage, nostrum utilitatem, with the result that we may honor God's greatness, that is his power and wisdom, and love both his goodness and the justice and holiness which derive from it, and imitate these as much as is in our power." In Theodicy section 177, Leibniz identifies three dogmas, he calls them, that contradict the fundamental principles of his Theodicy. They are that the nature of justice is arbitrary, that it is fixed but it is not certain that God observes it, and that the justice we know is not that which God observes. These false dogmas are pernicious, Leibniz says, because, quote, they destroy the confidence in God that gives us tranquility and the love of God that makes for our happiness. Extrapolating from the last statement, we may see Leibniz as ascribing two types of ethical benefits to Theodicy. First, in understanding God's justice, we acquire confidence in the rightness of God's actions. With this confidence, we are insulated from the disturbing effects of worldly evil, or if we are disturbed, we have the means of recovering our tranquility through reflection on the nature of divine justice. And this came out in some of the passages Greg quoted from letters to Sophie and Sophie Charlotte. Of special importance are perceived imbalances between virtue and happiness, crimes that appear to go unpunished and good deeds that appear to go unrewarded. This aspect of Theodicy, its capacity to support tranquility of mind, is the one most closely associated with the traditional idea of consolatio. In understanding the larger context in which God exercises his justice, we are aided in dealing with loss, grief, and perceived injustice, circumstances that reflect our limited power and vulnerability to fortune. Theodicy, though, also contributes in a more fundamental and profound way to the attainment of the highest happiness. In comprehending the justice of God's action, we acquire our fullest knowledge of the unity of the divine perfections of power, knowledge, and goodness, and this knowledge itself and our consequent love of God is for Leibniz the source of our greatest pleasure. The path to the highest happiness leads through the pursuit of intellectual knowledge and the imitation of God's justice in our dealings with our fellow rational creatures. Both of these forms of activity add to our own perfection and to that of the world, and so are immediately pleasing to us and sources of our happiness. But these activities by themselves cannot suffice for the highest happiness. That, according to Leibniz, presupposes the knowledge and love of God, which is both the basis of our confidence, our expectation that our present happiness will continue in the future, and the source of our supreme happiness, le suprême bonheur, identified with a perpetual progress in perfection and pleasure. And I think Leibniz says this most clearly in a passage from the Principles of Nature and Grace. For the love of God also fulfills our hopes and leads us down the road of supreme happiness, le chemin, down the path, because by virtue of the perfect order established in the universe, everything is done in the best possible way, both for the general good and for the greatest